My name is Idil Boran. I am Associate Professor and Faculty Fellow at the Nathalie Institute for Global Health Research at York University in Canada. I also serve as Associate Director of CFAL York at York University. We are a UN-affiliated leadership training, knowledge transfer, and capacity building hub at York University in Canada. Here in Bonn, I am affiliated as a non-resident associate researcher at the German Development Institute, and this side event is co-hosted in partnership between York University, the German Development Institute, the Zoological Society of London, and CATIE Solutions for Environment and Development based in Costa Rica. We gratefully acknowledge the support and collaboration of the Race to Resilience campaign for our side event and have the pleasure of welcoming the Race to Resilience among us. We also acknowledge the collaboration of OroVerde, Tropical Forest Foundation, and WWF Germany. We have a paperless side event, so please check our virtual media library for this side event whose QR code you see on the screen, or it is not there on the screen. However, you should be able to get the QR code and the link on the website and the schedule for the side events at the on the website of SB 56. The media library contains resources and information on projects from the side event, partners and participating organizations on the topic of today's panel. The urgency of the climate crisis is exacerbated by another global crisis, biodiversity loss. The impacts of the double crises are happening now. People are suffering. Their effects on human health, environmental health, and on communities are pressing, and they are exacerbated by underlying inequities. The Race to Resilience campaign plays a crucial role in raising ambition by cities, regions, business and civil society, local communities, as well as other stakeholders, and it is promising to be an excellent catalyst for actions that support nature, biodiversity, and people simultaneously, and to accelerate the goal on adaptation and resilience. Good research and data is necessary for tracking and verifying progress being made, and scalable and replicable ambition at local level is crucial and must include the voices and meaningful participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. In this spirit, we brought together perspectives from science, the research and data community, as well as regionally specific examples of non-party stakeholder engagement that relate to and are supportive of the objectives of the Race to Resilience campaign. And we are also delighted to have a representative from Race to Resilience, from the Climate Champion team here at the UNFCCC. And we look forward to a productive and congenial discussion with your participation. We have an excellent line of speakers for you today, and my colleague Andrew Deneault, who is sitting by my side and co-organizer of the side event, will be moderating. Andrew, you are a researcher at the German Development Institute, and you work on transnational cooperative initiatives, strengthening climate action in the Global South, urban climate action, and nature-based solutions. The floor is now yours to introduce our speakers and to do the moderation. Over to you.
Thank you, Idil. Today, we will hear perspectives from science, research, and data tracking of non-party actor engagement on joint action for climate, nature, and people, as well as examples of on-the-ground experience. For those following the side event virtually, you may write questions through the SB 56 virtual platform. We will monitor and curate the questions for the panel. For our first panelist, we are delighted to welcome Marcia Toledo, Lead of Resilience at the UNFCCC Climate Champions team, joining us virtually. Marcia is a Peruvian lead with a science background and 25 years work experience, delivering global biodiversity and climate change programs and partnerships, with a focus on adaptation and resilience. Since she joined the Champions team in May, Marcia provides strategic direction to enhance resilience, namely the systemic implementation by non-state actors across sectors and government levels. She oversees the work focused on the Race to Resilience campaign, mainstreaming resilience in key sectors, and enhancing dialogue on losses and damages. Marcia, thank you for joining us. You have the virtual floor.
Thank you very much, Idil and Andrew. I want to check if you can hear me well first. You do this. Yes, perfect. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to everyone. It's a pleasure to share updates and tell a little bit the story about the Race of Resilience and what we're aiming to deliver at the COP27 this year and, of course, beyond. So the Race to Resilience is a global campaign that was launched in January 2021 with the purpose to mobilize businesses, cities, regions, civil society, communities, and investors to accelerate adaptation and risk reduction solutions towards a resilient world. The campaign gathered initiatives and groups of non-state actors that were already implementing adaptation and resilience solutions and that collaborated around alliances, partnerships, coalitions, associations, representing more than 2,500 members and working in more than 100 countries. At COP26, these partners committed towards a common goal of increasing resilience of 4 billion vulnerable people living in urban, rural, and coastal communities by 2030, and agreed to implement the first global metrics framework to track results that contribute to resilience. So during the first year of the campaign, we had the power of the mobilization and collective commitments of non-state actors to common resilient goal focus on people, with the adoption of a pioneer world framework to help track and monitor the contributions towards resilience. A key point to highlight here is that this framework was developed with support of the Center of Climate and Research and Resilience Research in Chile, with scientists that form part of the IPCC in order to ensure robustness of the implementation. So we count also with a measures advisory group and expert review group in order to create the opportunities, the partnerships, but as well to make sure that we are having the enhanced science to deliver in regards of the quality of the implementation, together with the partners. The second year of the campaign, now we're focusing on showing progress and identifying how do we translate all those pledges and commitments of the different stakeholder actors and are able to tell the story of the contributions. What are the problems, what are the barriers, what are the challenges? So this is, of course, a challenge year in regards to make sure that we can be able to show implementation and we can track those results. This is important as well in order to be able to show clear and tangible contributions that reflects the needs and priorities of the local communities. We do want to make sure the campaign also collects the perspective of the vulnerable communities. The partners and the work of their members on the ground can foster those co-creation. And what is the room for governance, technology, finance, or other opportunities to enhance the co-creation of those adaptation and resilience solutions. So this year, we're aiming to contribute to the global stocktake process and to inform the discussions of the global goal and adaptation. It is critical so that the work of the non-state actors can help support and advance the government ambition and bring that innovation and mobilization of resources to action on the ground. What has become clear this year is the need to prioritize global adaptation and resilience efforts by delivering transformations needed in key sectors. For example, there's already quite a lot advanced in regards of freshwater ecosystems, as well in food systems, in cities, infrastructure, coastal and oceans, but there is still room to improve in other sectors and enhance opportunities to as well bring more adaptive and risk reduction measures, for example, in energy, siting, or others. We want to make sure that nature-based solutions can help enhance the contributions of those sectoral transformations. And we want to also identify where improvements in channeling finance, mobilization of finance, or accessing finance for locally led actions, as well as technology to inform early warning action or other opportunities to improve governance, can help enhance adaptation and resilience implementation. For this reason, the champions are building an agenda towards resilient solutions, projectizing or helping mobilize even more the actors towards those resilience actions. We're calling them resilience breakthroughs that can be deployed to address across sectors and those opportunities. We're already having partnering, delivering and advancing those multi-sector systemic solutions. At the end of the day, we want to foster an agenda that drives that multi-sectoral, multi-node state actors across levels of government implementation. But more importantly, this year we're also taking a closer look to ensure that these solutions respond to the needs of the communities on the ground and are co-created with the lenses of equity, human rights, and justice, giving the voice and participation to the vulnerable communities as they should be. COP26, it marked a milestone in regards of elevating resilience in the agenda, but we would like that in COP27, we have an agenda of visualizing results, helping to make it tangible, more concrete, and drive action towards projects that can channel finance, improve technology, enhance capacities to deliver resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for that insight into the Race to Resilience campaign, and particularly for highlighting the importance of connections with what is going on the ground. Our next panelist is Natalie Petterelli. Natalie is a senior scientist at the Zoological Society of London and actively works on developing knowledge, tools, and methodologies for conservation and the sustainable management of natural resources. Natalie, please set the stage for us with insights on the links between climate and biodiversity crises and the opportunities and challenges for adaptation.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about how we can use nature to address the climate change crisis, pointing in particular toward the risk and the unknown. Next slide, please. So as Idil has told you, we have another crisis at our doorstep. This is not just about climate change, this is also about biodiversity loss, with all indicators globally pointing towards a rapid and drastic loss of wildlife in the past few decades. Next slide, please. Now, what needs to be appreciated is that those two crises are linked. On one side, rapidly changing climatic conditions are directly threatening the long-term survival of many species. It's also impacting their movement and their distribution in response to climate change, which itself leads to an impact on the ecosystem functioning and on ecosystem stability. At the same time, this loss of biodiversity, of nature, of wildlife, is deepening the climate change crisis, altering the capacity of the Earth to sequester and store carbon that we emit, but also removing opportunities for our society to adapt to the new climatic normal. So here, what I want you to remember is that it's nature, not just trees, that is really important to tackling climate change. And this is why there has been a growing consensus for at least a year that the climate change and the biodiversity crisis need to be tackled in unison. Next slide, please. Now you have heard, no, this is not changing. Yeah. Now you have heard from Marcia that the way to think about tackling the climate change and the biodiversity crisis in unison is to think about what's termed a nature-based solution. And basically nature-based solution is about working with nature to address societal challenges such as climate change, while providing benefits to nature and to people. So example of nature-based solution can be, for example, protecting the rainforest. It can be restoring mangroves. It can be rewarding urban centers. But there's a catch to this. It looks on paper fantastic. It looks like a win-win solution. But badly deployed in the wrong place, in the wrong way, it can become a greenwashing exercise that is a menace to biodiversity, to people, and to human rights. Now, how do we prevent getting into that kind of situation, that catch? And there's a lot of reason why we get into those problematic situations. But one of them has to do with knowledge gaps, which is what I want to tell you about today. Next slide, please. The first knowledge gap has to do with biodiversity benefits. So we know biodiversity is a relatively complex concept. It's not as easy as carbon. It has multiple dimensions. It's difficult to measure. And so far, we don't know so much about the biodiversity benefits of nature-based solutions. And what we are lacking here is a framework for comparing biodiversity benefits across climate change mitigation, but crucially also about across climate change adaptation projects. Next slide, please. The second knowledge gap has to do with the impact of climate change on biodiversity. As I was telling you, we are reporting more and more how climate change is driving new distribution of species, but it's also altering the environmental niche under which ecosystems are thriving. And so that means that the condition under which restoration project might work are changing over time. And for now, we need to get a better understanding at tracking and predicting ecosystem on the move with climate change, or tracking to understand which one are facing collapse with climate change. So here, what the real need is, and where there is a lot of knowledge missing, is to identify areas where the restoration of existing ecosystem is likely to fail, but also identifying situations where restoration is the only option to avoid collapse. Next slide, please. The third knowledge gaps type have to do with the effectiveness of nature-based solution. The first thing to keep in mind is that much of what is known about the contribution of ecosystem to climate change mitigation and adaptation primarily comes from terrestrial ecosystems, and we know much less about marine and coastal one. The second thing is that we are not very good. Our understanding of knowing how change in climatic condition may jeopardize the effectiveness of nature-based solution is not well developed. In particular, our ability to predict local climate trajectories is quite limited, which means that our ability to assess the local suitability of various nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation is actually hampered. And finally, next slide, please. The last type of knowledge gap has to do with scale. Now, so far, a lot of our restoration activities have been carried out at relatively small scale, but the temporal and spatial extent of the challenge posed by the biodiversity and climate change crisis keeps on going bigger and bigger. And yet the scale of the response to biodiversity stress in particular has contracted in many cases over the same period. So what we are lacking here and what we need to develop is the knowledge and the evidence needed to expand activities from local action to large-scale responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for that thoughtful description of the climate and biodiversity crises. Our next panelist is Sander Chan. Sander is a senior researcher at the German Development Institute and adjunct assistant professor at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development, Utrecht University. He specializes in climate actions from cities, regions, companies, networks, paying particular attention to questions of effectiveness and justice. Sander, please share with us insights on recent work on methodologies for tracking and verifying effectiveness of actions. How do local, regional, and transnational actors interact for joint ambition for Climate and Biodiversity.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, the previous speakers. I think, we have set up, we have an understanding of nature-based solutions now, and in a way, like, the proposition of nature-based solutions is fantastic, At the same time, we reduce biodiversity, habitat loss, and we also support climate mitigation and adaptation. That's a very good deal, it seems, at least. So no wonder that we see a multiplicity of, maybe next slide, actors, businesses, cities, civil society organizations, all proposing more and more initiatives and networks to implement and collaborate on nature-based solutions across all levels and across borders. Next slide, please. But what outcomes can we expect from for instance, these initiatives that we just saw? Well, many have warned against greenwashing, including Nathalie just now. But if we look at the initiatives coming out of the Glasgow COP, for instance, there's a lot of worry here. Look at these headlines. But even good faith initiatives may not generate desired impacts because, for instance, the interactions between biophysical and socio-ecological systems are very hard to predict. Yet it is really necessary to understand whether these initiatives live up to their promises, these win-win gains, for instance. Next slide, please. But how do we track the progress and effectiveness of these transnational nature-based solutions? Because most data that we have, environmental data, for instance, is collected at the national level, and they cannot easily be disaggregated to individual initiatives or individual actors. Another problem is that this whole kind of transnational nature-based solution landscape is by nature voluntary. Non-state actors, they set their own goals, they choose their own approaches, and in the end it's super difficult to compare them. So then how do we know whether these actions keep their promises, whether they progress? Next slide, please. Now, we have developed a new database called the Nature-Based Climate Cooperative Initiatives Database, NCID. And we built this database to understand the landscape of cooperative nature-based climate actions and also to track progress. It samples all nature-based climate initiatives launched at major climate summits between 2014 and 2021, and it gathers data on actors, organizational characteristics, target setting, the geography of implementation, the functions they seek to fulfill, as well as performance. And I will talk a bit more about that later. But let me first share some field notes, if you want, from the emerging landscape of transnational nature-based climate actions. First, despite the growing emphasis on these nature-based actions, we actually see a decline in the number of these initiatives since the outbreak of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Oh, that is where we see the decline. Next slide, please. Second, we see participation by all types of actors around the world, and about 60% of all these actors come from developing countries. However, next slide, more than 80% of lead partners in these initiatives are from the global north. Now, this raises a lot of questions. For instance, whether the benefits of nature-based solutions really accrue to the most vulnerable communities and people around the world, and whether South-based, developing country-based actors have a sufficient say in these initiatives. Next slide, please. And this is not a trivial matter, because almost 3/4 of these initiatives are primarily implemented in developing countries. Next slide, please. And we're not just talking about online platforms and online internet databases. We're talking about initiatives that often implement activities on the ground. They directly affect people and communities in developing countries. Next slide, please. So just briefly on how we then assess performance of these initiatives. So we have devised an output-based measure which assumes a logical progression between inputs, outputs, and impact. So tangible production by these initiatives, whether these outputs result into behavioral change, and whether they ultimately help in solving societal and environmental problems. Now, in our measurement, we assess whether an initiative produces outputs that fit their aims and functions. So, for instance, an initiative that, say, wants to conserve landscapes through training local people can be reasonably expected to produce training material and training sessions. Next slide, please. Now, using this method, we have assessed all transnational nature-based climate initiatives that have been launched at climate conferences since 2013. And our analysis shows that a growing share of high-performing, we see a growing share of high-performing initiatives between 2013 and 2018. However, since 2019, the share of high and medium high performance initiatives have decreased. So our analysis cannot yet explain why this is the case. This is a worrying trend, but it might be pandemic related. Next slide, please. So to conclude, we see a couple of worrying trends. First, despite all the emphasis on nature-based climate actions, their number has dwindled since 2018. And second, we have also seen a lower level of performance since 2018. Maybe even more worryingly, these initiatives potentially entrench deep-seated inequalities. Although most of these initiatives implement in developing countries, they are mostly led by actors in the global north. Next slide, please. But we also see some opportunities. So most of you are familiar with the Global Climate Action Agenda, particularly the Race to Resilience and the Race to Zero. And these agendas, these campaigns could adopt clear strategies to engage more effective and legitimate nature-based climate actions. These campaigns can also set standards to what counts as legitimate nature-based climate actions. And this hasn't been the case much. The only instance where we saw a more elaborate strategy in the climate realm, in the climate action realm, to mobilize nature-based solutions was at the 2019 UN Climate Summit. Now, finally, our study here shows that shows at least one method to track this field of transnational nature-based actions. They might be hard to compare, but there are ways to at least understand whether they, in the most minimum way, actually are more than promises on paper. Now, we believe that this tracking will become more important, especially as nature-based approaches gain more political attractions, and we need to understand whether they really deliver on their promises. Next slide, please. I think that's the last one, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Sander, for sharing important findings on tracking cooperative action from climate and biodiversity initiatives. Our next panelist is Johannes Horstmann. Johannes is joining us from OroVerde Tropical Forest Foundation and is the coordinator of a joint EBA project named Resilient Caribbean Communities. It's being implemented in cooperation with Welthungerhilfe and local partner organizations in Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Johannes, please share with us insights and examples of ecosystem-based adaptation measures from ICI-funded projects on EBA in the Caribbean. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this side event and for this opportunity. I would like to share with you some insights and lessons from two of our projects, EBA projects, ecosystem-based adaptation, for those who might not know the acronym term, both financed by the International Climate Initiative, ICI, of the German federal government. Next, please. So OroVerde is implementing these two EBA projects together with several partner organizations in Central America and the Caribbean. And in both projects, the idea is to use the EBA approach to increase climate resilience of rural communities whose livelihoods depend directly or indirectly on ecosystem services. And the idea is to make a contribution to biodiversity conservation at the same time with these projects. Let's see a few more details of this approach from the first project in the next slide, please. So what you can see here, the dark areas on the map are the core areas of the biological corridor in the Caribbean, CBC. Some of them are protected areas, for example, national parks, and altogether they constitute one of the world's biodiversity hotspots with a lot of endemic species, a lot of migratory species, and many of them are critically endangered. The idea of the CBC Transnational initiative is to conserve this set of ecosystems as a whole, to the benefit of the species, but also to the benefit of human communities living and depending on ecosystem services provided by these natural ecosystems. Next, please. So in line with this idea of the CBC, our CCR project targets some of the connectivity areas in between those core areas. These buffer zones close to protected areas is where people are living and where they are having their fields for agricultural production. And together with our partner organizations in these countries, we're implementing EBA measures. I will show some examples on the next slides. Not yet, please, sorry. To improve the people's livelihoods. This means also to improve land use techniques and, after all, to improve the income that they can have from agriculture. And by achieving that, we can reduce the pressure that these rural communities often put on the remaining patches of natural forests and ecosystems which are in protected areas, and often we are facing severe problems of effective conservation within protected areas. So, and this is precisely how OroVerde works on the integration of adaptation strategies on the one hand and biodiversity on the other hand, together with our partners, Welthungerhilfe and other partner organizations from these countries. Next, please. So now just very briefly, some examples of EBA measures that were identified as solutions to current problems, but also to future challenges imposed by the climate change and climate change impacts we are expecting. Agroforestry systems, for example, with coffee and multiple other crops have various benefits. One could be they reduce soil erosion when we compare it to conventional agriculture, especially on steep slopes. So if you imagine this would be without trees, a bare field, of course there's much more erosion as a problem. This can be avoided. And talking about biodiversity, of course, agroforestry systems also offer a lot more biodiversity within the same plot compared to other production systems. We have many examples from our projects that agroforestry systems make the production and also the revenue, the income of the farmers more resilient to climate change impacts. So, for example, hurricanes or periods of droughts. The second example would be community-based reforestation. It contributes rather directly to reducing vulnerability in rural areas. For example, the freshwater availability can be improved. In terms of drought, we will see the result. And landslides and flash flooding can be prevented in the case of tropical storms and rains. Next slide, please. Here are two more examples of EBA in the field. Again, about erosion. To avoid gully erosion, there is this possibility to build barriers that reduce the velocity of surface runoff water along steep slopes. And on the other side here, we can build this kind of terraces, flat terraces with some perennial plants. And this improves also infiltration of rainwater into the ground, and it also helps to reduce erosion on this plot. Next, please. So finally, we would like to highlight the importance of EBA governance. Lessons from our projects show that we have to include the most vulnerable groups not only as beneficiaries of projects, but as actors in local decision-making processes, so that they will be empowered to put their local adaptation process into practice and also to continue it in future years once the project has ended. So in the Green Watershed project, local governance mechanisms are being established to bring together different stakeholders within the same watershed. Here's the example of Conoriaque, a council in Dominican Republic. The objective is to facilitate the coordination and reconciliation of interests, especially regarding scarce natural resources like water. And in our second project, the CCR project, we used the MAP approach. We call it MAP for multi-actor partnership, a kind of platform at a local or regional level. Here's an example from Haiti. There's always a common interest among stakeholders from a given area to be prepared for climate change impacts as good as possible. This is the same interest for all. And the idea of the multi-stakeholder platform is to join these forces to promote replication and upscaling of ecosystem-based adaptation, aiming at increased resilience throughout the whole region and then also beyond the end of the project. So to make climate change adaptation processes really successful over time in the long run and to effectively increase climate change resilience of communities, we believe that the governance aspect is really crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for sharing the experiences of OroVerde. Our next panelist is Julika Tribukait. Next, we have her contribution will be from WWF Germany. Julika is a policy advisor for coastal ecosystems at WWF Germany. She works in various fields of environmental policy, mainly in the context of international cooperation. She manages and coordinates the joint mangrove initiative of BMZ, IUCN, and WWF entitled Save Our Mangroves Now. Julika, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I'm delighted to now present a bit on the marine and coastal side of things. So we've heard from the introduction, or I don't know how much you're aware of the focal areas of the Race to Resilience campaign. So coastal areas are definitely a focus, and I'd like to share actually some project examples and most importantly key lessons learned we have at WWF from concrete projects on marine and coastal nature-based solutions. So next slide, please. Yeah, so I see the font changed a bit, but I hope it's still readable for everyone. Just to remind everyone why exactly marine and coastal ecosystems are so important for resilience. So a real real turning point for how oceans, marine and coastal ecosystems have been considered also under the UNFCCC or in context with climate change was obviously the IPCC SROC report a few years ago, which actually looked mainly at impacts and risks, so impacts of climate change to the ocean, but that would then obviously affect coastal communities as well. So if we look at the world's population, it's 40% of the global population living within 100 kilometers off the coast. So obviously sea level rise alone threatens them, let alone increased frequency of extreme weather events and storm surges. In addition, population density in coastal areas is twice the world's average, so space is rather limited in coastal areas. But it's not only about where people are located, but also to what extent they rely on ecosystem services in that area. So about 60 million people in the world are actually engaged in fisheries and aquaculture and rely on those sectors for food and income. So looking at only very few expected climate change impacts, as I said before, frequency of extreme weather events will increase significantly. And coastal erosion caused by climate change alone, we're talking only about the erosion part, will most likely displace up to 5.3 million people within this century. Next slide, please. So within WWF, at one point, after the IPCC SROC came out, we looked at, okay, how to actually integrate the ocean and climate change agenda. And we came up with 4 principles. And as you can see in the slide, the second and the third are basically key to what we're talking about here today, about resilience. So first of all, make nature part of the solution and put people at the center. So that's really 2 of the principles guiding our work in that sphere. But let's get a bit more concrete. Next slide, please. So our key approaches with regard to what we call resilient coastal habitats for resilient coastal communities is, first of all, advocating for the integration of marine and coastal ecosystems in national commitments, strategies, development plans. Obviously, NDCs would be a main target, but it's also important to keep in mind that actually a lot of different ministries are involved and agencies when it comes to the coastal area. So roundtables with policymakers from all concerned sectors are crucial here. Secondly, the work with the communities is really key. So we are trying to actually, through the projects we're implementing, focus on a community-based management approach that for the protection of coastal ecosystems, but also with regard to fisheries. And last but not least, of course, we need more funding actually to protect and restore marine and coastal ecosystems. So initiatives like the Race to Resilience campaign are helpful in that regard. Let's have a look into some of our projects. Next slide, please. Yeah. So that's actually one of the outcomes of the Save Our Mangroves Now initiative I'm coordinating. This initiative is very much focused on policy advocacy, so how to get the right message to policymakers and how to make them aware of the importance of, in this case, mangroves. So what we did is actually socioeconomic profiling of mangroves in 4 countries in the Western Indian Ocean. And we found that basically coastal protection and carbon storage are of the highest value. So that's in particular in the context of climate change, something that will raise awareness of policymakers what role these ecosystems can play. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we need to tell policymakers, or at least give them guidance on what to do and how to integrate actually marine and coastal ecosystems conservation in their respective strategies. That's why we came up with mangrove principles, which last year been adopted by the Madagascar government as one of the first in the region. Next slide, please. So going to another part of the world, what was very successful in Belize, so our office in Belize actually worked with the NDC partnership, which is supported by the German and has been initiated by the German government. And they were really successful in integrating coastal and marine ecosystems in their NDCs. And that's mainly, again, because they initiated a multi-stakeholder dialogue, brought everyone to the table, and enabled all relevant government agencies, but also representatives of local governments to join and come up with a good strategy. Next slide, please. Looking more at on-the-ground projects, we are also working in Fiji and Papua New Guinea, and here it's really a combination of mangrove conservation, restoration efforts, and fisheries management, because for resilience it's really key that people have secured their livelihoods, that they are not only protected against future climate change impacts, but they make a proper living out of the natural resources they have at hand, in a sustainable way, obviously. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to share about another project in Belize is that there is now ways and promising approaches in terms of coral reef restoration. So obviously conservation goes first, and we want to conserve what's there. But since we face a severe loss in coral reefs due to climate change, science has put a lot of effort in exploring ways to restore coral reefs, basically. And Belize is one of the first places where we actually pilot that, again, in very close cooperation with local actors, local fishermen, and try to integrate it into their daily activities. Next slide, please. So that's the last project example I wanted to share. Here I find it really compelling. So it's the Mesoamerican Reef. 4 countries are included. And the project really hints at the fact that science-based approaches are needed. So this is a project that's conducted in collaboration with Stanford University. And for once, measures haven't been set before the project started, but the whole project is about actually identifying the right measures for each of the countries participating. And that has proven very successful, because it's also all about individualized approaches. Next slide, please. So let's look at the key lessons learned and what I can share from the projects we've conducted. So what we found, first of all, long-term engagement with communities is really key. Quite often we have project cycles of about 3 years. Funding comes in, approaches are implemented, there is participatory approaches to them, but actually a lack of participatory approaches in planning. And then certain approaches are brought, and after 3 years, the donor is out again and the community is left with nothing. So long-term engagement is really key, and that also necessitates a change in how donors fund projects, so that long-term engagement is actually possible. Secondly, livelihood security is also key. So when we talk about the use of natural resources, of course, I'm working for a conservation organization, but we also need to consider that people rely on fish, for example, for their daily livelihood. So, and without sufficient income, people, the coastal communities, are the ones who are supposed to actually conserve and in the end maybe also restore natural ecosystems. They need to have secured livelihoods before they can really act. Get the message right for policymakers. What I find extremely helpful and important is to always highlight the co-benefits, so that natural ecosystems, marine coastal ecosystems, provide jointly mitigation, adaptation, and resilience functions. I have also highlighted with regard to one of the projects that national dialogues are necessary for good integration into national strategies and commitments. Collaboration with science partners. All action needs to be science-based. Conservation before restoration, and also, utterly important, learn from restoration failure. So mangroves have gotten a lot of important awareness and attention over the past years, but barely one talks about the failures we've experienced in especially large-scale restoration projects. So it's really important to learn from these. And last but not least, respect connectivity of ecosystems and apply, in the case of coastal and marine ecosystems, a seascapes approach. So don't think only of one ecosystem, but the connectivity between them. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julika. So just to sum up, I'd like to thank all of our panel speakers and to go over what was covered. Marcia shared key information on the race to resilience. Natalie set the stage speaking on key issues on climate and biodiversity interactions and how they impact adaptation and resilience. From Sander, we heard how tracking output performance of collaborative initiatives can support the race to resilience. Johannes shared insights for how ecosystem-based adaptation supports communities in the Caribbean. And Julika gave an overview of marine and coastal nature-based solutions. Thank you to all of our panelists. We're going to shortly open the floor for questions. What we'll do is, if you can perhaps raise your hand, Idil will come find you. And in the interim, I'll ask each panelist, starting with Sander and going right, or actually, can we get Marcia? Is she still here? We'll start with Marcia. And we'd like to ask you, what is one of the most underserved issues or critical actor that can make a big difference for accelerating adaptation and resilience by leveraging the power of nature? Thank you. Marcia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a tough question, since I will believe it depends on the context, as adaptation and resilience is very, very much localized. But what can help perhaps scale and allow sustainability? I could think about definitely two key actors, which are how do we engage with the private sector and how do we engage with the finance sector in order for making the case of those investments, methods, and approaches that can be adopted or considered as part of the business plans. So nature-based solutions already is incorporated in many of those efforts, either in agriculture or in other ecosystems that might be clear the contributions, not only for the production, but also in the water sector and agriculture, for not only for the production and consumption, but also for the benefits that generates to the people and nature of the, as part of the business. But what is perhaps, again, if we're going to be looking at, you are advancing adaptation and resilience, you are hoping for solutions that can deliver that across time, it is critical how do we mobilize the finance, impact capital, philanthropies to be part of that agenda. Of course, there is quite a lot of overseas development assistance and support of very leadership countries like Germany, Canada, or the UK in a specific, or Netherlands in specific nature-based solutions. But if we do want to have a sustainable approach that will require, as part of models for building a resilient planet, then it will be really critical to as well change the rules or adjust the mechanisms or discover new instruments that can allow better channeling and especially access for locally led actions. So I will at least say those to keep the momentum and keep the scaling and sustainability of those actions.
Thanks so much, Marcia. And I'll now turn to Sander, the most underserved issue or actor that can make a big difference for accelerating adaptation and resilience.
I think the bigger question about nature-based solutions and climate action, actually, in the global climate action agenda, is there's only so much you can kind of spotlight and kind of show as best practices. I think the bigger question is, to what extent are these approaches being picked up by other actors? Are they being replicated? Are these approaches being picked up by others? And I think that is a process that is rather opaque, because none of the elements of the Global Climate Action Agenda, be it Marrakesh Partnership, the Race to Resilience, the Race to Zero, or a Momentum for Change, they really look at, what happens once we have, spotlighted nature-based solutions. Does it help them? Do they grow? Do they get more financing? Do they scale? It's really not that clear. We have started to do some research on that, particularly Momentum for Change initiatives, which is kind of an awarding scheme under the UNFCCC. And we looked at whether these initiatives receive more funding and more growth and experience more replication also by third actors once they are spotlighted, once they have received an award that recognizes them as best practices. So we do see some effects, but we continue to do research on that.
Johannes?
Same question?
Yes, underserved issue or actor. Is there
All
a
right.
critical issue or actor that can make a difference?
Well, maybe in the same line as also Sander just mentioned, I might pick two aspects that could be very helpful in this regard. One is, as we are having solutions, nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation solutions, we have a lot of examples and experiences. What we are struggling for is to bring these lessons into national policy instruments, into frameworks that would help to, in a way, mainstream and upscale these kind of solutions, and this is how we could achieve a much bigger impact. But of course, then we have a policy framework, but we are not touching the ground yet. And then comes in the second aspect that could be governance mechanisms, where we have local or regional organizations of stakeholders and maybe farmers' organizations or all those stakeholders and institutions which are really managing the landscape on the ground. And if they are well organized and well connected with the national framework, having international funding, for example, for adaptation, then we could really come to the ground and have a positive impact for adaptation on a larger scale. So this would be maybe the two.
Thank you, Johannes. Natalie?
Well, on top of what has been said, I think the one that I worry the most about are any kind of knowledge actors. So there is a tendency to think that we all know what we are doing, and therefore we can devolve that to another group of people that will just implement, without realizing the scale of what and the difficulty of what we have to do, and how this will have to be managed in an adaptive way, where you need to constantly look at what's happening and then reconsider your knowledge, add extra knowledge to then develop better solution. And so you really need platforms where those knowledge actors, and that's not just scientists, can actually feed in and help develop better things, because what we don't know what we're doing. Let's be clear. The scale of what is hitting us is so big that there's absolute need to engage all form of knowledge actors into this. And I worry sometimes that this is not done well enough.
Last but not least, Julika, please go ahead.
Thanks. I think I would like to start off with what I consider a bit of an overestimated actor. So there, and it's good, and I'm not saying we shouldn't make opportunity or make use of the fact that the private sector is engaging more, but there needs to be very clear criteria. So in the ocean sphere, we get a lot of requests actually by private companies now on blue carbon, and we're very well aware of the fact that the intention mainly is offsetting, right? Carbon carbon credits, and we need clear frameworks for that, and that's not the solution. And I'd like, secondly, to second what Johannes just said, I think we also need to keep in mind that even though private sector can leverage more finance, some of the services provided are clearly basic services that need to be provided by states. So if we look into the coastal sphere, coastal protection, for example, for people, that's something the state needs to ensure and to guarantee. So integration in relevant strategies is key. Of course, finance, then again, is always an issue, and especially in developing countries. But I think making it just like key part of whatever is planned in terms of infrastructure, for example, in the coastal sphere is just crucial.
Thanks so much, Julika.
Fantastic. And now, as we are moving to the Q&A with the audience, and this is a hybrid event, and thank you to all the panelists, and really excellent insights, and especially that last point, Julika, with the criteria and how important that is. And thank you, Andrew, for excellent moderation. So the way we're going to do it, because this is a hybrid event, I am going to engage the audience here, and we are so grateful that we are convening here in Bonn after 3 years of hiatus. And I'm going to ask Andrew, my colleague, to monitor the online platform and curate questions from there. But because we have this fantastic audience here with us, and I know that there are some questions, so I do want to bring then the microphone. So please raise your hand. So we ask that question to our panelists. Can you identify an underserved or issue or actor that can help us develop recommendations for accelerating ambition that leverages the power of nature? And you can also ask your questions and your comments as well. So before you do that, please introduce yourself with your name and affiliation. And I come now to give the floor to our first participant from the audience.
Thank you very much. I had planned to go to the other side of it, but I'm really glad I stayed here, actually. It was really interesting. No, I had, I'm Taru Bahri from FAO Fisheries and Aquaculture Division. And I have a comment and a question. So the comment is that I could not agree more on many of the conclusions of the presentations on the need for, involving local communities in decision making and planning, and implementing the management measures. And for this, we really need to strengthen all the governance structures, from national to the level, and all these communication channels. And then I had a question, because this morning I went to listen to one of the roundtables on the global stocktake, and there was a comment from one country on specifically on nature-based solutions, where they asked specifically not to use the term nature-based solutions, because they were mentioning that this terminology came from the global north. I think this was what was used, and they prefer to use ecosystem-based adaptation. So I was, because of my ignorance on this topic, I just wanted to have some clarification on this from the panel. Thanks. Because I'm sorry, because given that we're discussing, on leveraging action and accelerating action, and Mr. Chan was showing that, in developing countries, there was a small uptake on nature-based solutions. So I was wondering whether this was related to the low level of action that you have identified in your research. Thanks.
Thank you so much. A burning question on terminology to the panel.
Maybe someone else can talk about the terminology, but I think one thing to think about nature-based solutions is that it's not only a nexus. It's not only about integrating kind of the climate and the biodiversity aspects, policy aspects, and then somehow be more effective and have actions that deliver on both. But think of it maybe as a frontier as well. it is an area that is quite new. I mean, of course, there's a longer history of working between nature and climate. However, with a framing of nature-based solutions, you do get new actors kind of getting on board. And therefore, it is so important when we have a race to resilience or a race to zero to kind of set the boundaries and explain and to set a standard what legitimate nature-based climate action is, because there is also good reasons to worry about greenwashing in this space, and that is, I think, the controversy that is partly related, talked about in that conversation. But
I'll just add a very quick thing about terminology. So you're absolutely right that there are differences which capture the difference in values, but also the tension that are around the distribution and nature and what it implies in terms of deploying those kind of solution, which is why you see ecosystem-based adaptation. I think you saw it through our presentation too. We used the different term somehow to also illustrate and display that flurry of terminology. What is important, though, I think, in terms of ecosystem-based or nature-based solution, it's just to capture this idea that an ecosystem in biodiversity has a definition, and that sometimes you can have solutions that do not systematically involve an ecosystem, but part of nature, which is probably why some are more comfortable with nature-based solutions. But at the end, I think it's really important to, one, acknowledge that diversity, to understand and acknowledge the values that leads to those differences in terminology, and then engage people in a way that resonate with them, if that answers your question.
And maybe to very quickly add a bit on the terminology and what's happened in international policy processes around that. So first of all, the whole term was developed by the IUCN, or the concept, and they came up with a standard. And I'd like to remind people, actually, it's not only about biodiversity and climate. So nature-based solutions as a concept is directed towards supporting sustainable development goals, right? So it's been mostly discussed in the biodiversity climate nexus, but so per definition, it should serve sustainable human development and biodiversity, and it's not necessarily linked to climate. It's been picked up in the sphere, and it's been heavily debated because especially people from developing countries, negotiators from developing countries felt like, okay, that's opening up doors for offsetting again, for credits, for greenwashing. Another argument was that there's no clear definition. What changed this year was a UNEA resolution on nature-based solutions. So there is a UN-accepted definition, which is talking also about the rights of indigenous peoples, for example, but not sufficiently enforcing the rights-based approach yet. So that's something I think we'd still need to push for. And on the EBA side, this term is very much preferred also under the CBD, because it's been there for a long time. There's guidelines and clear standards, and that's quite acknowledged. I think personally nature-based solutions is broader and gives a lot of potential, includes EBA and can make good use of the guidance developed there. And of course, we still have a bit of a way to go to come to the same point with nature-based solutions. But yeah, just a bit on terminology.
Thank you so much. Another question from the audience. Please introduce your name yourself first. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Tom Mitchell. I'm from Climate Kick, an innovation agency. So a number of the panelists talked about challenges in different ways with getting enough funding to where it matters, and equally which stakeholders are involved in actually delivering that funding and the appropriateness of that. And equally some comments about the kind of speed of delivery and concerns that the kind of international system is not delivering the speed that we need. And yet none of you have necessarily referred directly at the moment to some of those structural problems with the funding mix that is driving that. And I just wonder whether you could comment on what you see as, if we were to optimize for transformation and speed to strengthen resilience, what type of design would we be looking for in the international funding mix that might be able to make that possible?
I'll start with this because that's a really good question. So one of the problems is the clusterization of problems, which means that international funding generally is associated with different conventions, and we don't have a strong structure for problems that tackle more than one problem. Which means that we really don't have the structure to promote those win-win projects that guarantees some form of positive on more than one front. So definitely at the international scale, more collaboration between UN Convention and linked to the delivery of the funding for promoting those projects that tackle more than one convention-related issue is definitely something that would love to see going. But as I think I was referring to some of the challenges, this is linked to somehow demonstrating a positive impact on biodiversity, which means agreeing on a framework that shows positive effect on biodiversity as well as climate in the context of the climate biodiversity nexus. And this is also lacking or not as strong as it could be. That's primarily because the monitoring framework for climate is much stronger than the one for biodiversity. So yes, agree. Probably we didn't go on this because you could do a whole event and more on that topic.
Thank you very much. The next question.
Thank you very much. My name is Anselm Ducho. I work for GIZ. And thank you for sharing your research and your practical experience with EBA. Fascinating. I just wondered, like, only 5 years ago, before Corona, there wouldn't have been one of these events without talking about economic instruments, without talking about payment for environmental services. That was, I don't know, and now none of you actually explored that issue again. I'm sure you're working with that, I'm sure you do research on that, but it was not an issue anymore. So where do we stand on that? Is there a big disillusion already with this concept? You made one mention on offsetting and maybe carbon finance, okay, and also you had a critical view on involving private sector at all, I think. But I mean, the concept of who pollutes pays or who consumes eco-services should pay for it, is that an issue anymore, or I don't know?
I'm happy. I'll go quickly, and then. Well, I think it is an issue, but we are past the point at which we just need to pay people to do better. We need all to be quite frankly involved with the problem, which means that we cannot only market an issue, saying that if you do good, we'll pay you. We also need to involve all type of other solution where people choose to change, whether it's the way they do different things in a way that will not be monetarized, if it makes sense. So I don't think the problem has disappeared. I think there was some form of wanting to make this discussion broader than just around incentivize change in behavior, if it makes sense.
And further to this, to the same question, if I'm not fully mistaken, in one of the examples that I showed from Dominican Republic, actually they do work also with this mechanism, payment for ecosystem services, because they already have established this council where they gather multiple actors, and these are really also companies which are responsible for drinking water provision in urban areas, and they also have agricultural industrial scale plantations, so they have a lot of irrigation agriculture, and there are big players, not only small scale farmers. And what they are negotiating is precisely how could they finance ecosystem-based adaptation measures within the same watershed but upstream somewhere in the long run. So this is what we are working about in this project. And we're, let's say, developing models for this kind of mechanism. So it's still in use, and we are trying to put it into practice and make it work so that really the consumers pay for the ecosystem service provided, and it is only provided because others do an effort to conserve it in a way, others upstream.
Thank you so much. I would like to turn to Marcia, joining us virtually to weigh in. Marcia, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, excellent. In regards to the recent question about payment for ecosystem services, I fully agree with what the previous speaker mentioned. It's critical for sectors like water. There's water funds, several running in the world, very much based on payment for ecosystem-based approaches. But there are other cases. It's not that it's not important, it's not happening, but it's a menu, it's an instrument across many others. And maybe here the question is more, how do we interlink them? How do we have a systemic approach to deliver adaptation and resilience? So that is one instrument as per the opportunity to develop. Perhaps a response in regard of structural problems, I think that's a great question because, we recognize there are many solutions on the ground. We recognize many actors are delivering ideas, are delivering science, are delivering showcasing and proving concepts to really have potential to scale or replicate. We are fully aware of that, but what it becomes difficult to how to channel that and how to bring to a next level is how do we move away from that diluted. It's like adaptation and resilience requires a holistic approach, but is somehow so difficult to grasp where are we going, how do we move into a resilient planet, what we need to do first in order to start turning the wheels towards resilience. And it becomes difficult to grasp it and to organize finance or to organize investments or to organize city level commitments or others. So perhaps a question that I'd like to throw back to all of you is more, what if we as a community that is interested to move and have an organized agenda on adaptation and resilience can help inform what are those intermediary milestones that we need to reach across all those system solutions. We're talking here beyond just sector solutions, system solutions across multiple sectors, across multiple stock actors, are non-state actors, across multiple levels of governments, so that we can bring the right level of community level engagement, the right level of finance, governance setups, technology or tools that will require the scaling. And if we think about a no-regret adaptation and resilient goals, while we are still in the discussion at the UNFCCC to build the global goal of adaptation or to inform the global stocktake, we can help everyone to be more organized in regards to where we need to go and how we can also inform we are on that pathway to advanced resilience. I think there are many efforts to try to give some sense of north. So probably for me, my answer to the structural problem is as well, let's try to aim to help to gain clarity where we need to go, where it needs to those problems to be resolved, what innovation solutions can be scalable, and which ones are not working, so that we can also not replicate those mistakes.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you also for highlighting the systems solution. So we have a line of questions from the audience. I do want to check with Andrew to see if we have some questions from the online platform before I turn to our on-site audience here.
We don't have visibility of some of the online questions, but I would encourage you that if you've posed a question and we haven't addressed it, please get in touch with us, the organizers, or the individual panelists. But I'll leave it to Idil to take another question from the audience here. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew.
Sure. Thanks a lot to all the panelists. I am another one of those convinced. I was going for another one and I stay. I'm Jacobo Charan. I work for Oxfam. And a quick comment and a question for the panel, whoever wants to answer. The quick question, the comment is about the race to resilience and the race to zero, and who is being, I think it's been Sander that has been commenting, you know. I think it's important that we make a strong difference between both of them, okay? Because I think that the race to zero, it's something that we've been commenting. I'm so happy that we've been using, or you have been using greenwashing in more than one case. Okay, so that race to zero, it needs to come in the first place with a huge amount of reduction on emissions, and then we can talk about how can we offset or how can we really use nature-based solutions. And this is something that we insist every time that we talk about neutrality and zero, because if not, yeah, it definitely is greenwashing. And following also on Tom's questions and you know other structural issues, and you were talking about governance, not just only finance, but the governance. And when we talk about, I mean, the obvious you were saying, which is, you know, this needs any nature-based solution needs governance for the communities that they are, you know, implied on it. As I say, the obvious. But I really would like to hear from the panel if you have any example of, you know, national governments or local governments, I would say, imply to a scale on these nature-based solutions, okay? Because very often when we talk about the governance of the communities, we think and we talk about those directly affected and we see with feet on the ground. But I think another structural or important issue is that we see national governments with nature-based solutions in their adaptation plans, in their different plans. Okay, so I think if you have examples, I know that you've been bringing some examples, but how do they connect to the government plans? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for the question. I have a rather limited view now looking at our projects. I would say yes, the governments are in. We have focal points in the ministries to talk with them about our EBH projects, and it is clear that we have the idea that lessons from our projects will be lifted up into national policies in a way so that they are aware of it and that they can design the best national policies based on our pilot experiences. And in Haiti, for example, if you read the document, you can already find EBA as a keyword. You can find GEF finance projects that are focusing EBA. So this is coming not a long way, but already several years, and the governments are starting to actively work on this approach as an adaptation strategy. So they design policy instruments, and they also themselves implement pilot projects. So I see they are getting active on it, at least in Haiti, Dominican Republic, and in Cuba, which is another country. Well, we have so many more, Guatemala, Mexico. So they are really attentive to this topic, and I think developing their national policies already.
Thank you. Further insights from the panel?
Yeah, so I think if we look in the climate realm, NDCs, for instance, they don't really refer to nature-based solutions all that much, really. And I think the references that come closest are probably reference to forests. And even those references are oftentimes, you know, very superficial or kind of they lack, you know, details. I do think there are some smaller countries that actually have much more elaborate strategies on how forest may play a role in their climate strategy. I would have to look up which countries, but generally I think there's a will to win in NDCs, for instance, in how to include nature-based solutions in NDCs.
Thanks. Maybe reacting directly to that. So I think there has been increasingly mention of nature-based solutions in NDC. So at least for the coastal marine sphere, we know that a lot of countries actually have integrated them now in the updated versions, in the revised versions. But what we also heard back from the Western Indian Ocean, from some of the responsibles, is that, yeah, okay, we included it now, but how do we actually implement it? And that's a big challenge. I think that's a big task for us as well, to provide guidance here. The challenge is, as I said before, many different institutions, ministries are most of the time engaged. And I think personally, biggest impact would be achieved if we not just talk to environment ministries, for example, but finance ministries, or those ministries responsible for infrastructure planning, for example. So nature-based solutions need to be part of bigger spatial planning attempts at national level. So far, the best example I've heard of is Belize in terms of marine and coastal nature-based solutions. So that's definitely a country to learn from. And maybe just quickly allow me 2 more comments on the previous questions. So in terms of international funding mix, I think one important thing to consider is that we need also to cut harmful subsidies and redirect certain financial flows. So that's definitely something to look into. And with regard to the comment on what about payment for ecosystem services, and I'm not completely against private sector cooperation. I just think we need to focus on minimizing external effects first, to work with companies and make them reduce actually their external effects, so change production and also on the consumer side, consumption patterns. And then of course the rest that remains that cannot be reduced or whatever, there we can see what we can do with this money, but we cannot open the door wide for offsetting, just for clarification.
Thank you so much. I'd like to check if Marcia would like to weigh in or not, or please let us know.
Just very briefly on the comment regarding what criteria or what measures both races, resilience and race to zero, are taking to be very careful at preventing greenwashing. I mean, we're totally, fully agree that that is a no-go, that there is no opportunity that allowing greenwashing will definitely help advance the purposes of both races. But it is an issue that requires more looking at carefully criteria or other mechanisms to track, verify, and report on the implementations as per the commitments or the pledges of the partners joining both races. And the scrutiny is at both races at the same level. Of course, there is always an opportunity to keep reassuring that there is a learning loop and an improving loop. So I do not want to say it's not an evolving process, but for sure it is something that we're looking at it also very carefully. We want to prevent that. Then comes an opportunity for thinking about resilient washing. That is also not an opportunity. So already we're thinking about how do we make sure with the methods, criteria, and ways of verifying can the race to be as far as possible of those contexts. So thank you for raising that concern, but it's also our concern.
Thank you, Marcia. We have time for one more question from the audience.
Thank you very much, highly appreciated. My name is Steffen Bauer from the German Development Institute. And first, let me quickly thank the organizers and speakers for this very timely discussion. And in my perception, the debate around nature-based solutions and even more so a nature-positive economy is still very much lopsided towards the mitigation side of things, and the point about blue carbon is a case in point, I think. So my question is, when we do these like data collections on nature-related initiatives, and that would go to Sander, is whether and how do you distinguish in the first place between such nature-related initiatives that are about resilience or more about mitigation, race to zero? As much as I appreciate that this session is dedicated to the race to resilience, and that's a strong statement in itself. And then is that distinction even reasonable and relevant? And there I would be especially interested in Nathalie's opinion from speaking for the Zoological Society.
We have to close momentarily, so then very quick closing answers to this question.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. It's a very relevant question. Like what I presented is just kind of like the top line tracking of these initiatives, but we do kind of use categories for different types of climate aspects, like what do they try to achieve? Is it adaptation, mitigation, a combination of both? We are also actually working with Idil to kind of review, I think, all kind of the most important typologies of nature-based solutions to try to understand, you know, what is out there and what might be missing, which we also are trying to translate into our data collection.
Thank you. Closing question from Nathalie.
So am I right that you want to know whether what are the synergies in terms of the possibilities for looking at those type of solutions that deliver on both adaptation and mitigation? Is that right?
I think there are probably a lot of synergies there,
yeah.
Especially when it comes to nature-based solutions. So the question is that distinction even reasonable from like your expert perspective, or is this an obsession of technical negotiators in the realm of UNFCCC?
No, I think it's an important distinction. And I'll go very quickly just to say, because the reduction to carbon is what creates the highest chance for greenwashing. Adaptation is a much more multidisciplinary and comprehensive, inclusive way of thinking about how to tackle climate change, which offers much more opportunity for having a rational discussion as to how nature can help.
We come to the close of this fascinating session. Thank you very much to our panelists and to the audience for your questions. And until next time, keep well. Thank you. You're welcome. We are leaving. Yeah, I mean, it's good I checked the time. Yeah. My wife was slow. So.
Oh, okay, I understand.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Great.